In 1970s, Britain, 45,000 PUBs enforced a set of unwritten rules that governed every British man's life. Rules that were never written down, never formally taught, and yet breaking any single one of them could get you cast out from your local pub, shunned by your workmates, or branded with the worst insult imaginable in 1970s Britain, that you were not a proper bloke. The 1970s were a strange decade for British men. On one side, you had centuries of tradition, deeply embedded codes of conduct inherited from Victorian ideals of stoicism, duty, and emotional restraint. On the other, you had a world shifting rapidly beneath their feet. Feminism was rewriting the script on gender roles. Heavy industry was beginning its slow, devastating collapse. The three-day week of 1974 had already shown just how fragile the old economic certainties were. And by the end of the decade, the winter of discontent of 1978 to 1979 would make that fragility impossible to ignore. The old certainties that had given structure to a man's life, his job, his role in the family, his place at the bar, were suddenly being questioned. And yet, through all of that upheaval, a remarkably detailed and rigid set of unwritten rules persisted. Rules that shaped how men spoke, how they drank, how they dressed, how they grieved, and how they loved. Start with the single most sacred institution in the 1970s British man's life. Not the church, not the workplace, the PUB. There is a line that comes straight from the Brewers and Licensed Retailers Association's publication, Passport to the Pub. It goes like this: if you haven't been to a British pub, you haven't seen Britain. George Orwell made a version of the same argument back in 1946 in his essay The Moon Under Water, where he laid out his vision of the perfect British pub with almost religious reverence. In the 1970s, that ideal was truer than it had ever been. Britain had roughly 45,000 pubs, approximately one for every 1,000 people. But that cold statistic doesn't begin to capture what the pub actually meant. It was the village living room, the place where deals were struck, friendships were forged, grudges were nursed, and grief was silently processed over a pint of bitter, and the beer itself had become a cause. In 1971, a group of drinkers alarmed by the homogenization of British ale founded CAMRA, the Campaign for Real Ale, which rapidly became one of the most successful consumer movements in British history. Its very existence tells you something about how seriously British men took their pint. The pub had rules too, serious rules, the kind that experienced regulars obeyed instinctively without even thinking about it, but that they would mutter and grumble about the moment an outsider got them wrong. The single most important social obligation in the entire unwritten British male code was this: you always buy your round. In any group of 2 or more people, one person buys drinks for everyone. This wasn't charity, it wasn't generosity, it was a binding social contract. Every other member of the group would take their turn buying a round, and when everyone had gone, the whole cycle began again. What made this uniquely British and genuinely baffling to foreigners was the almost religious significance attached to it. Not buying your round wasn't a breach of etiquette, it was heresy. Social anthropologist Kate Fox studied this extensively and concluded that the round-buying ritual existed to minimize the possibility of violence between drinking companions. The logic was that reciprocal gift-giving is one of the most effective means of preventing aggression between individuals. In the British pub, where men struggled with intimacy, found it difficult to express friendly interest in other men, and could turn somewhat aggressive, that ritual was essential. The Mass Observation Project, which had been documenting the minutiae of British social life since the late 1930s, had reached similar conclusions decades earlier in its landmark study of pub culture in Bolton, confirming just how deeply embedded these rituals were. As one particularly astute publican put it, if the men didn't buy each other rounds, they'd be at each other's throats. They can be shouting and swearing, but as long as they're still buying each other drinks, I know I won't have a fight on my hands. Buying your opponent a drink was a symbolic handshake. proof that you were still mates, regardless of whatever argument had just erupted over football or politics or whose turn it was on the dartboard. Layers existed within this ritual too. Unspoken sub-rules added real complexity. You didn't order something extravagant on someone else's round. One account from the era captures this perfectly. A man recalls his father saying that your heart would sink when someone in the round asked for a whiskey. Worse still was the man who'd order a whiskey on someone else's round, then switch back to a pint when it was his own turn to pay. That kind of behavior could follow a man for years. Here's a detail that often surprises people. In a British pub in the 1970s, there was no table service. None. You wanted a drink, you got up and went to the bar. Sitting at your table waiting for someone to come to you marked you out instantly as either a tourist or worse, someone who thought they were above the system. And when you did reach the bar, you didn't tip in the conventional sense. What you did, if you were feeling generous, was say to the bartender, "And one for yourself." That was the accepted way of showing appreciation. Subtle, indirect, perfectly British. The pub was also where men engaged in one of the few socially acceptable forms of intellectual competition. The pub quiz took hold in Britain during the 1970s and became another arena where the unspoken rules applied. You didn't gloat when you won, you didn't sulk when you lost, and you certainly didn't accuse anyone of cheating unless you were prepared for the conversation to escalate significantly. For men who didn't drink or whose workplace culture ran along different lines, there was the Working Men's Club. These were a distinct institution from the pub, more formal in their membership structure, often attached to a trade union or a specific industry, with their own committees, their own rules, and their own codes of conduct. In the mining towns of Yorkshire and Durham, in the mill towns of Lancashire, the Working Men's Club was as central to male social life as the pub was elsewhere. Different in character, identical in purpose. There is a broader rule that underpinned not just pub behavior, but virtually every aspect of a British man's public life in the 1970s, and it is the one most people have heard of, the stiff upper lip. That phrase, interestingly, was American in origin, first appearing in print in the Massachusetts Spy in 1815. But by the time it crossed the Atlantic and embedded itself in British culture, formally introduced to the UK in 1871 through an article in Charles Dickens's magazine All the Year Round, it had become something far more than a phrase. It had become a philosophy, a code of emotional conduct that shaped generations of British men. The stiff upper lip meant emotional restraint, calmness under pressure, understatement, and a duty-bound refusal to show distress or complain. In Victorian England, this wasn't just preferred behavior, it was considered a fundamental mark of masculinity. And that is where the 1970s gets complicated. By that decade, most social commentators would have agreed that the stiff upper lip was technically a thing of the past. The upheavals of the 1960s, the decline of empire, the rise of affluence, the counterculture, all of this had supposedly loosened the emotional straitjacket. Therapeutic practices like primal therapy and group analytic sessions were gaining popularity, encouraging cathartic emotional expression. For the average British man, though, particularly working-class men, the stiff upper lip remained the operating system. You did not talk about your feelings, you did not cry in public, you did not burden others with your personal problems. If someone asked how you were, the answer was simply fine, regardless of the actual state of affairs. This connected directly to another deeply held rule. You did not discuss money or personal matters. Salary, wealth, weight, age, any of these topics were considered deeply impolite. A man's financial situation was his own business, and asking about it was tantamount to an invasion. Volunteering the information was equally suspect, either boastful or pathetic, depending on the numbers involved. Step outside the pub, and into another cathedral of British masculinity in the 1970s, the football ground. 20 million people attended football matches in England in 1975, and as one writer noted, it was nothing short of a miracle that half of them did not fall ill with food poisoning. Going to a match in the early to mid-1970s was not, by any modern standard, a pleasant experience. The stadiums were crumbling, the toilets were prehistoric, the food was inedible, and crowd trouble was ever present. The environment extended an all-boys school atmosphere into the open air. Standing in a mass of men, most of whom gave off a heady combination of sweat, tobacco, booze, and onions, was something you simply endured. But Saturday at 3 o'clock was sacred. Men's league fixtures kicked off on Saturdays at 3 p.m., and the ritual surrounding them was as structured as anything in the pub. You would gather at the local beforehand, walk to the ground together, and stand on the terraces, often in the exact same spot you had occupied for years, sometimes decades. Football clubs like Manchester United, Liverpool, and Arsenal were not just sports teams. They were symbols of local identity. Supporting your club was not a hobby. It was an inheritance, something passed from father to son as immutably as a surname. The rules of the ground were clear, even if no one stated them. You didn't switch allegiances. You didn't sit in the wrong end. You took the discomfort without complaint because complaining was weakness. The darker side of this tribalism was visible in the firms that had formed around certain clubs. Manchester United had their Red Army, Millwall, their Bushwhackers, and the violence these groups brought to terraces and town centres alike led to moments like the 1975 Leeds United European ban, when the behavior of supporters resulted in the club being barred from UEFA competition. Football hooliganism was, by the mid-1970s, a genuine crisis, and it was inseparable from the same codes of honor, loyalty, and masculine identity that governed everything else. The late 1970s also brought a new dimension to the terraces. The skinhead subculture, which had its roots in the late 1960s, remained a visible presence in football grounds throughout the early and mid-1970s, with its own strict codes around dress, music, and allegiance. By around 1977 and 1978, a new style was beginning to emerge from this working-class football culture. The casuals, young men who wore expensive European sportswear and designer labels as a form of identity and one-upmanship. It was a fashion-conscious subculture that added an entirely new layer of codes and tribalism to the experience, though it would truly peak in the following decade. Speaking of fashion, the 1970s had their own unspoken rules about how a man should present himself. In the early part of the decade, hippie fashion still held sway, with bell-bottom denim jeans, loosely fitted checked shirts, and old military clothing. By mid-decade, things had shifted toward the casual. Most men wore simple jeans with a shirt, t-shirt, or sweater, and denim dominated. But alongside this, something more subversive was gaining traction, particularly among young men who idolized flamboyant musicians like Mark Bolan, David Bowie, and Freddie Mercury. Vogue proclaimed in the early 1970s that there were no rules in the fashion game anymore. For the average British man outside London, though, there absolutely were rules. You dressed appropriately for the occasion, a well-tailored suit for formal events, clean but not flashy for the pub, practical for the football. The key was restraint. Elegance if you had it, but never ostentation. Then there were the rules of chivalry, and these were perhaps the most contested of all in the 1970s. Traditional etiquette was crystal clear on this. A man stood when a woman entered the room. He held the door. He walked on the side closest to the road. He took her coat on arrival and was responsible for returning it. Each of these acts was, in the traditional view, an expression of respect. But when the feminist movement went into full swing in the 1970s, some women began rejecting these gestures entirely. Feminists were caricatured, sometimes unfairly, as critics of both traditional femininity and traditional masculinity, and men found themselves caught in an impossible position. Patriarchal society was being held responsible for every injustice against women, yet individual men often felt they had done little to oppress anyone. Their inherited traditions were suddenly under scrutiny, and they felt squeezed between the codes they had grown up with and the new expectations being placed on them. As Debratz, Britain's leading etiquette authority, would later clarify, good manners are about consideration, not choreography. Hold the door for anyone. It is courtesy, not courtship. But in the 1970s, that distinction was far from clear, and many men simply carried on as they always had, hoping that basic decency would see them through. In the workplace, a different set of codes applied. Among Sheffield's steelworkers, the dangers of heavy industry had generated ideals of manliness, that prized physical strength alongside care and cooperation between mates. Social and emotional bonds played out through union organization, associational culture, and shared leisure. Until the collapse of heavy industries from the late 1970s onward, these men's lives and the codes they followed had remained remarkably stable. For white-collar workers, the after-work drink was effectively compulsory. If your boss or a colleague invited you to the pub after work, you said yes, always. You might nurse a single pint and make your excuses after an hour, but you showed up because not showing up sent a message. And it was not a message that helped your career. Smaller rules carried real weight too, the kind that might seem trivial but were not. Meeting someone for the first time meant a handshake. Firm, not aggressive, but firm. No hugging, no kiss on the cheek. You maintained proper body language, an upright posture, subtle gestures, a nod or a wave, no wild expressiveness, no grand displays. Punctuality was non-negotiable. Being late to a meeting, an appointment, or a social occasion was considered genuinely rude. Arriving 5 to 10 minutes early was the mark of a man who respected other people's time. And you never, under any circumstances, turned up at someone's house unannounced. An uninvited house call was frowned upon for the risk of inconveniencing the homeowner, and that risk was considered entirely your fault. Then there was the queue, the great, eternal, beautiful British queue. No pushing, no shoving, just a polite shuffle as each person ensured they occupied their rightful spot, often apologizing for standing too close. Even in an area with no visible line, the British instinctively formed one, whether at a bus stop, a post office, or a chip shop. Cutting the queue was not just rude, it was a moral failing. Invited to someone's home for dinner, you brought a gift, a bottle of wine, flowers, or chocolates. At the table, you held your fork in your left hand and your knife in your right. You did not speak with your mouth full. You chewed quietly. Needing to leave the table meant excusing yourself. And when you finished eating, you placed your knife and fork together on the plate to signal you were done. These were not suggestions. They were the marks of a man who had been raised properly. What strikes you, looking back at all of this, is how deeply interconnected these rules were. The stiff upper lip, the round buying, the queuing, the chivalry, the punctuality. They all served the same fundamental purpose, managing the tension between people forced to live and work in very close proximity while maintaining the polite fiction that everything was fine. These rules were the social infrastructure of a nation that prized order, fairness, and above all, the ability to get along without making a scene. And they persisted even as the economic ground shifted beneath them through power cuts and strikes and the slow death of industries that had defined what a working man was supposed to be. Many of these codes have evolved, some have vanished entirely. A rise in multiculturalism, a changing economy, and the introduction of gender equality laws have all shifted Britain away from its rigid old-class system. But some persist. The queue endures, the round buying endures, the instinct to say sorry when someone else steps on your foot very much endures. And if you want to understand the British man, not just of the 1970s but in many ways of today, you could do a lot worse than understanding the world he inherited. A world of unspoken rules, silent expectations, and the quiet, stubborn belief that doing the right thing meant never having to talk about it.